Good morning, everybody, on this snowy Washington morning. Luckily, the worst of it, I believe, went to our north. My name's Mike McShane. I'm a research fellow in education policy studies here at AEI, and I'm very excited to offer for you all today a bit of a twofer. First, we are excited to have Senator Tim Scott addressing us about school choice. And then in the second half of our program, talking about an exciting new book that's out detailing some experiences of families participating in school choice program here in Washington, D.C. We're doing this program as a part of National School Choice Week. For those of you that are unfamiliar, I believe this week there are over 11,000 events planned across the country to raise awareness about school choice and to advocate for more options for parents to send their children, which we're happy to be a part of. But without further ado, it is my great pleasure, great honor to introduce Senator Tim Scott. Senator Scott has served in the United States Senate representing the great state of South Carolina since 2013. Before that, he worked his way all the way up from a county council member to a state house representative to a United States representative to the august body of the U.S. Senate. He has really distinguished himself as a champion for low-income and working-class families, both in education reform, in workforce preparation programs, and in helping families make ends meet while working so hard. We're so happy to have him here today, so if you'd please join me in welcoming Senator Tim Scott.
Well, good morning. Good morning. How are the three of y'all doing out there? Good. So good to hear all those good mornings out there. Well, thank y'all for having me here today, and thank you, Mike, for such a gracious introduction. It's great to be here at the start of the National School Choice Week. Many of you may have heard my story before, so I won't give you the whole story, but I will give you the Reader's Digest version, just in case you need to hear it twice. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see. And I will tell you, as a freshman in high school, I was really lost, truthfully. I had come from a single-parent household, did not realize that all drifting leads in the wrong direction, and so I was drifting. There's no doubt that the good Lord has a sense of humor, because as a freshman in high school, I failed civics. I'll let that sink in for a second there. I thought to myself that I am the only United States senator to ever fail civics. Then I spent 2 years in the United States Senate. Realized I may not be alone. Yes. But my academic struggles led me to see the power of education and its importance to all kids, no matter their zip code, no matter their family's income, and no matter their ethnic background. The truth of the matter is, access to a quality education is a must. Unfortunately, while we are spending record amounts on education, we're spending record amounts on education, we are not reaping record-breaking performances. And that's tough. It's tough on kids. It's tough on the future of our nation. Let me make it clear. It is absolutely paramount that we act, and that we act now. It is simply not fair to our kids, it's not fair to their parents, and I don't think it's fair to the future of America. I don't believe in any silver bullets in education, but school choice is a leap, not a step, but a leap in the right direction. At the end of the day, this journey is not about the numbers, it's about people. It's about our children. That's why I have launched my opportunity agenda with school choice as its foundation. And it starts with the Choice Act, which I will introduce today in the 114th Congress. My bill provides choice for families who have kids with special needs, families who live on military bases, and certainly it strengthens the DC Opportunity Scholarship, or OSP. I was excited when I looked at your book and found some really amazing studies and quotes from some of the kids there. And one quote really struck me, and his sentiments that seemed to echo so many other kids just like him, especially minority kids. And I wanted to quote him. He said, speaking of the OSP, it gave you a way out of nowhere. You're not the one with the killer's jump shot, but you're still trying to go somewhere and go to school and get away from this environment. You've got that opportunity to use your scholarship. I think that those words are truly profound when we understand and appreciate the impact that school choice is having right here in DC. That's the power of school choice. Through my school choice bill, the Choice Act, I had the opportunity to meet other amazing kids. One in particular stands out, a young lady with special needs. Her name is Rachel Lewis. When she was a kid growing up in South Carolina, her parents, living in a different part of the state at the time, could not find a good school to fit her needs. But when they moved to Greenville, they found a school called Hidden Treasure. It's an amazing school. And Rachel started to blossom. She was able to finish high school, and now she's around 20 years old. She doesn't have a single job. She has 2 jobs. She's realizing her full potential. And one of the things I walked away with having, after I visited Hidden Treasure, is the sense of belonging, which allows for the full expression of all of your gifts. It allows you to realize all of your potential. And reading the letters from the kids who attend the school, for the first time, many of these kids feel a sense of belonging, being invited to birthday parties, not being made fun of at schools. So not only the education from an academic perspective, not only a skill set, but also a sense of who they can be and who they will be. I believe that Rachel and other kids, the kids that I just quoted, they all spell school choice, H-O-P-E, hope. Thank you.
So the senator has a little bit of time to take perhaps 1 or 2 questions before he needs to leave. For those of you that are following along at home, who weren't like our brave audience, braving the cold, there is a hashtag for this event, hashtag #ScottAtAEI. Feel free to send questions to that as well. I think our first question will be right over here, Max, if you'd be so kind. If you could do me 2 quick favors. 1, please identify yourself with name and affiliation, and if you would be so kind as to ask a question, since the senator has limited time, we'd like to get in as many as we can. Thank you, sir.
Good morning, Senator. My name is Nate Madden from the Catholic News Service. How are you doing today?
Doing well, Nate. Thank you. Hope you are.
I am. How would your Choice Act affect parochial schools and religious homeschooling groups?
It doesn't specifically target it, but what we do see in much of the conversation on the Health Committee is to continue to look for ways to provide flexibility to parents who are making those very difficult choices. We work with the mantra that the more choices a parent has, the greater the chance that the student has. So our perspective panoramically on the issue of educational choice includes parochial schools, and certainly see the benefit of creating as much flexibility as possible.
Thank you. Another question up here, Max, if you'd be so kind. If you could, again, just wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Eleanor Cliff, the Daily Beast. Can you explain what your proposed legislation exactly does and where it would get money from and how it would ensure that the public schools are not damaged?
Well, I'll start with the end, and I like those compound questions because I typically don't remember the beginning of them, so this is wonderful. I'll tell you the fact of the matter is when you look at the funding, if I were able to move the school choice in the direction that I would like, what you would find is that when you look at the portability or the backpacking of the funds for kids who are going to leave their public schools, it certainly leaves enough money back to continue the education of the kids that are there. Frankly, as I have studied the issue at home and abroad, I've come to the conclusion that we can do both. We can walk and chew gum at the same time, so to speak, and it's an important opportunity for us to engage parents, teachers, and the educational apparatus in a very fundamentally different way. Specifically to the Choice Act, it does a couple things. First thing it does is it helps and strengthens the DC Opportunity Scholarship. It makes sure that we are able to carry over funds that have not been used in prior year, and it also focuses some of those dollars to marketing and advertising. As you know, that I think it was in 2012, the waiting list for students in the DC area for a school, charter school, was over 20,000 students. And frankly, for $21,000 per pupil versus an OSP school, which at that point 2 years ago was averaging about $8,500, that the choice should be pretty obvious. We're going to lead the charge for the OSP in the Senate along with Speaker Boehner in the House. And frankly, what I think you'll find is that when you drill down into those numbers and you look at the results of the numbers, I think in the normal public schools here in DC, about 56% of the students graduate. When you go to an OSP school, about 90% of the kids are graduating, and about 90+% of the kids are going on to 2 or 4 year education. So that's one specific part of it, is enhancing the opportunity to carry over the funds. Second part really creates flexibility for kids with special needs. It gives their parents the opportunity to move forward and find a school that best fits the needs of their kids. Classic example was, in fact, the Hidden Treasure. Third part is it creates an opportunity for the military to look at 5 different bases to start a test program to see if, in fact, we are able to engage school choice on military bases, specifically bases that may be located in underperforming school areas. That would give those kids an opportunity to get a quality education, no matter where their parent goes to protect our nation and put their lives on the line.
Thank you so much. Other questions? Rick?
Senator Rick Hess, AEI. You've expressed support for Senator Alexander's efforts on reauthorization of ESEA, but you have also indicated that you want to make sure that in seeking a compromise, they don't move too far away from promoting choice through ESEA.
Yes.
Are there a couple of bright lines that you would suggest as ways to tell whether a reauthorization is being responsive enough to concerns of choice?
Yeah, I think I don't want to start talking red lines. We know what federal government folks do, that when they talk red lines, they forget about them. Must be my banking joke. Anyways, I'll just tell you, the fact of the matter is that we're looking, we're going to work with Senator Alexander as we roll out the hearings that we're having. Last week we did assessments. This week we'll do helping teachers in the classroom. My hope is that we'll have an opportunity to have a robust discussion on how to make sure that what we see in Title I today is either strengthened or expands the opportunity for school choice, especially in those underperforming areas as it does today. Frankly, as we see the advent of charter schools, from my perspective, that is nothing more or less than public school choice. So as we continue down that road, I'd like to also see other opportunities, because when you look at the lottery system that has to exist to help these kids get into schools, frankly, it tells me that there is a population that is underserved. If we can find ways to expand that opportunity, I think we do our nation a service.
Other questions? Any remaining questions? Yes, we have one right here, Max. Or actually, Isaac, if you'd be so kind as come here.
Hi, Senator. Kyle Hauptman at AEI. I know the point here is to help these students, but Kevin Hassett here and some others have looked at the economic benefits of school choice. As you know, there's a lot of people, young couples in D.C., that if it weren't for the charter schools would be in Silver Spring or Arlington or somewhere. In New York City, many of them would have left as well. They can't afford the private schools. They don't like the public schools. And do you stress at all the economic benefits, the property value increase that some of these can bring? It's a real economic development tool, perhaps, right?
Yeah, it certainly is. We have not stressed that, and I am not an expert in that area. I have spent a lot of time looking at what happens to the average parent whose child is a part of OSP here in D.C. What we've realized is that we're talking about someone whose household income is right at $21,000 a year. I mean, I'm not sure how much you make or how much anyone makes, but raising kids around the $21,000 mark is a difficult task. Several years ago, my mother was making a little bit more than minimum wage, raising 2 kids, and it was challenging. So I know what it does for the kid living in poverty. I know the opportunities that exist, and then frankly, when you look at the graduation rates, I know that when you study the results of education on lifetime income, there are millions of dollars added to lifetime income. There have been some studies done that I've read but I haven't studied yet that suggest the actual economic impact to communities as well as the revenue stream that comes to the government when those folks go to work, as opposed to becoming a dependent. Some kids and families become more dependent on the social services that are provided through the government. So it's really a counterbalancing opportunity in and of itself. But the long-term impact on property values, as a fellow who ran a county for 13 years, I can just tell you that in the parts of Charleston County where the schools were the most underperforming, the average value of a house, this is probably 7 years ago, 8 years ago, was around $75,000 in North Charleston, where I'm from. Places where the schools were the best, the value of the house was a little bit over $250,000. Household income, that was Mount Pleasant in South Carolina. Some of you may have visited Kiowa. Most of their kids, I think all of their kids, go to private schools. The value of that house on Kiowa is, I can't add that high. All I know is that the property taxes that came back were between $30,000 and $50,000 per home on property taxes. So there is a substantial delineation between those schools that are succeeding, those schools that are not succeeding, and what that means from the economic picture that is painted through school choice, or through the opportunity for high quality education.
I think we have time for one last question Max has over there.
Hi, I just wanted to piggyback on Rick's question about Senator Alexander's bill. As you know, the bill includes language that would allow Title I funding to follow a student, if it's okay with the state, to the public school of their choice. Do you feel like some school choice advocates feel like that doesn't go far enough? They want to see language that would allow Title I dollars to go to a private school, and I'm wondering if that's something that you plan to push for, or if you plan to separately push for vouchers, a private school voucher.
Yeah. Well, I think I haven't come to the conclusion what I'm going to push for at this point as it relates to that conversation. I certainly think that it's a positive step in the right direction, though I would love to see some leaping occur. In my perfect world, we would allow much of the Title I's funding to go to a private school, not just public schools. What happens and what occurs in some of the public schools that I've gone to that have really succeeded is that you see, I won't call it an overpopulation, but you certainly see that the challenges of those schools that are succeeding, taking in more and more students, become somewhat of a challenge at some point. So if there are alternatives and options that are available that can ease some of the pressure on the high-performing schools and or provide more charter opportunities, I think you'd see parents taking advantage of those options. And at the same time, I personally would love to see that Title I funding available for private schools as well. Not necessarily where I think the Senate is going right now, but it certainly is a position that I've had for many years.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much,
Yes, sir.
Senator. If you could join me in thanking Senator Scott. I know you have to get back for a vote. Thank you, sir. So we are going to have a bit of a cast change up here. I'd like to invite our panelists up to this stage. Our second act is going to be a discussion about the work that Senator Scott just referenced, talking about a new book out by Dr. Patrick Wolf, who's here at the end of the dais, called The School Choice Journey, which was a sort of in-depth look at the DC Opportunity Scholarship, the very program Senator Scott was talking about strengthening, and specifically the experiences of students that participate in it. So the way this is going to work, Dr. Wolf is going to take 10 or 15 minutes here, give you the sort of key facts, the key things that he found in his book, then we're going to open it up to a conversation. As I said before, those of you that are following along at home, if you're on Twitter, the hashtag is Scott@AEI. You can also feel free to tweet questions at me at MQ_McShane. So without further ado, Dr. Wolf, if you want to go ahead and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Mike. I'm delighted to be here. The book, The School Choice Journey, is a story of challenge and transformation and triumph. And it's almost a metaphor for this event today, because we faced a lot of challenges. I think many of us were transformed by them, but we triumphed because we're actually here. Unfortunately, my co-author, Dr. Thomas Stewart, is not here because the challenges were too great. The travel challenges were too great for him, and also we weren't able to have the books, actual copies of the books, available for sale here. But I encourage all of you to take a flyer. We have a 30% discount flyer that's on the table outside, and I encourage you to explore that opportunity. So basically, the motivation for this is that the previous research on school choice, particularly private school choice, has a certain flavor or character to it. It's dominated by quantitative studies. They take a black box approach. That is, program is launched, a lot of things happen over a multi-year period, and then outcomes are measured and analyzed. And basically, these types of studies don't look at what's happening in that black box, all those things that are happening in between launch and outcomes. And basically, they're also very test score centric. They focus on test scores as oftentimes the sole measure of success of a program. Now, it might seem that I'm being unfair to my colleagues in the research community who struggle hard to produce these kinds of studies, but I'm really criticizing myself because I've led the majority of the private school choice evaluations that are quantitative, black box oriented, and focus obsessively on test scores. So no one knows the weaknesses of the research base more than the researcher himself. So what is really missing is sort of the subtle nuances of how families experience school choice. That's a clear element that's missing. And also the effect that school choice has on behaviors and habits that can have some very important long-term implications. So that's what motivated our study in this case. Why do we call this a journey? We felt the journey was an excellent metaphor for the school choice experiences of these families because journeys are challenging, they're adventurous, they're exciting, you need some preparation, you need some guidance, you don't always know where you're going to end up, and oftentimes you are transformed by the experience. And so we felt that all the characteristics of a journey, like the one that I engaged in yesterday from Fayetteville, Arkansas to Reagan National Airport, had all of these elements, and it was very consistent with what we saw the families participating in the program experiencing. So the subject of our book is 100 families participating in the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program. That is the first and only federally sponsored private school choice program in the United States. It was launched in 2004, authorized through 2009. Basically, it was eligible. To be eligible, students had to be low income, live in the District of Columbia. Between 1,000 and 2,000 students participated in this program. And basically the idea of our study was to document their experience using focus groups and focused interviews, individual personalized interviews with the families. This is a qualitative research method called phenomenology. And the idea is to capture the essence of what they were experiencing in this school choice program. So our main findings are that parents seek the opportunity to shape their child's education. They typically begin by focusing on sort of essential needs like safety, and they generally assess the progress of their students in school through subtle behavioral measures and not necessarily test scores. So those are important findings in our research. But probably the most important finding in our research was the potential transformative power of participation in school choice. For most of the parents in our study, this was their first experience of explicitly choosing the school that their child would attend. And what we found is that these parents, like typical low-income inner-city parents, are not very politically active. They weren't that experienced with consumer choices In many cases, a television was the most significant consumer purchase that they'd ever made. So they weren't used to the kinds of high impact purchases of even buying a car or buying a home, for example. We found that there were some challenges for these parents initially. We found that in many cases they had a clientist mentality, and I'm going to talk about that a bit in the next slide. And we also found that with programmatic supports and coaching, that these parents became highly involved consumers and highly differentiated consumers of their child's education. And when they were threatened with losing the opportunity of exercising parental school choice, they became politically activated. So, parents as shapers of their child's education. Basically, our parents told us that shaping requires options. So you see the quote here from one of our parents that, the scholarship gives you an opportunity for choice to choose the best school. You're not stuck with just one school. I think that's very good. So here, this parent saw choice as a mechanism for having more control and more influence over their child's education, in contrast to compulsive residential assignment. And then the quote from that student that Senator Scott mentioned is also one of my favorite quotes about not having the great jump shot, because I don't have a great jump shot, and I want to go somewhere. So, parent priorities. This was an interesting finding from our research, our study of these 100 families, and that is that parents use Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. Most of you are probably very familiar with this. This is the major thinking of psychologist Abraham Maslow, and his argument is that human beings tend to focus on very basic needs until those needs are satisfied, and then they are liberated to pursue higher order needs. For many of these parents, their children are stuck in schools that they feel are unsafe. And that really concern them about the basic safety of their children. And so when we first asked parents, what's the most important characteristic of the school you're going to choose for your child? This was at the very launch of the program. Many of them said safety. And this immigrant parent, as you see, says, I think safety was a lot of the reasons why most parents chose different schools was safety. Also, that was a big issue for me, safety. Now, she repeated the word safety 3 times, in part because she's struggling to learn English, but in part because that concept, that need, was first and foremost in her mind. Repetition signals importance, and in this case, this parent was signaling the importance of safety. So one of the benefits of our longitudinal study was we re-interviewed these parents and held new focus groups every year throughout the 5-year period. So 3-4 years into the program, parents started saying different things about what they were looking for in their child's school. Basically, and at some point, one of the parents just sort of jumped out of her seat and said, we are focusing more on academics now because our children are safe. So she's basically just channeling Abraham Maslow in that statement. In our final set of focus groups, we had a set of themed focus groups throughout. Parents who had children in elementary school and middle school and high school. Parents who had opted out of the scholarship program were scholarship decliners because we felt we could learn things from them, and parents for whom Spanish was their family's main language. We combined all those focus groups in our last session. We had 36 parents, and we handed out these clickers so that they could give answers in real time to close-end questions. And probably the most surprising finding was when we asked them, how do you assess your child's progress in school? And gave them a set of sort of standard evaluative criteria. And a majority of parents basically said it's their motivation. The child's motivation towards school is the number one criterion that they use to evaluate their child's progress. Another 9 gave the response, you know, that it was their study habits, and others gave responses about motivation and attitudes towards school. And you see that the last category was test scores, and a grand total of 0 parents gave the response that they rely on test scores to assess their child's progress. And this really surprised us because we're education researchers and we are obsessed with test scores. But in a sense, it makes sense. Why do parents use behavioral and attitudinal measures of child success as opposed to test scores? Because they can, because they see their child on a daily basis, and they can recognize these subtle shifts, these subtle changes in habits and behaviors that can have very significant consequences in the long run, as Senator Scott mentioned, in terms of graduation, in terms of productive, economically productive, and socially responsible citizenship. So what about the empowering potential of school choice? And this is the real focus of the book. We know certain things about the characteristics of low-income families. These are unfortunate things about that many low-income families share. They often don't have the resources that higher-income families have, particularly two-parent families, two-parent intact families, financial resources, and extensive social and professional networks. They often lack those. As I mentioned, they don't have as much experience with major consumer purchases, so the necessity to engage in extensive search and to choose wisely, maybe that isn't as familiar to them. And they have this clientist sort of approach in many cases because they're used to being the passive recipients of social programs. And finally, there's a very depressing literature in political science, which is my home discipline, about how politically inactive low-income inner-city minority families are. So all of these could be challenging for these families participating in this choice program. So what is clientism, consumerism, and citizenship? These are concepts that are central to our book. Clientism is typified by a power asymmetry. Basically, the recipient is passively receiving something that's being given to them, and there's an expectation that they just have to suck it up and be happy with whatever they get. All the power is on the other side of the table. With consumerism, it's typified by a balance of power. Basically, the provider receives something that they want from the recipient. The recipient receives something they want from the provider. That's the source of the power balance, and there can be negotiation and choice and all these sorts of things that give a lot more control and influence to the recipient. And finally, there's citizenship. And citizenship takes it to the next level in terms of meaning active participation in shaping the power relationships in society. And of course, as citizens of a representative democracy, the expectation is that all of us will be active citizens and will be the rulers who are shaping the power relationships in our society. So what were some challenges of the journey? We're very explicit and upfront about this. This was not easy for many parents participating in this program. They encountered a number of problems. These included insufficient and inaccurate information, insufficient school search, that there was some lack of transparency regarding financial arrangements of the program, especially initially. There were cases where students were stigmatized and called out as being scholarship students in their schools, and that was potentially psychologically damaging to those students. And there was the perverse incentive. This is a means-tested program with a very strict means test at 185% of poverty. And we had parents tell them that they qualified just below that means test and then subsequently refused promotions and pay raises so that they wouldn't earn out of eligibility for the program. It doesn't help a family to get another $2,000 of income if they lose a $7,500 scholarship for their child. And finally, there was a challenge of student adjustments to the behavioral and academic expectations of the new schools. And we had parents talk about how they struggled with that because their students ran into problems at the school. And I led a very interesting focus group where this dominated the discussion. And finally, a gentleman who was participating spoke up and said, we can't bring the bar down. We have to bring our students up. We have to make them meet those high behavioral and achievement expectations. But not all the parents agreed with that, and we can understand why. So these were generally problems early on in the program, and almost all of them were addressed through policy change and programmatic change. Particularly, the law was amended so that once you qualified, you remain income eligible for the program. So everything seemed to be going along fine. And then all of a sudden, the school choice journey of these families was threatened with an abrupt end. The OSP was initially authorized for a 5-year period. That's pretty typical for a pilot program. In 2009, Congress had to revisit the program, and they decided to close the program to new participants and cut funding. As a result, the U.S. Department of Education actually rescinded 216 scholarships that had been awarded to new students for the program. They canceled those scholarships. Those students were not allowed to exercise private school choice. And basically, at this point, up till this point, the OSP parents had not been active politically. We questioned them about their political engagement. It was very low. They expected this program to be automatically renewed. It's a program targeted to low-income kids, their children. They didn't understand why anyone would object to it. When the program was challenged, this one parent spoke up and said, we still need school choices for our children until things are better for us in the public schools, so we are going to have to lobby. And lobby they did. So in the penultimate chapter of the book, we talk about how we witnessed the empowerment of these DC families in the struggle to reauthorize the Opportunity Scholarship Program. So from 2009 to 2012, basically program enrollments dropped. They had to drop because students could leave the program through graduation and through transferring out of DC, but no new students could enter it. And that's when the program dropped down from about 2,000 students to about 1,000 students. The implementer of the program, the Washington Scholarship Fund, resigned in protest of the limitations placed on the program. Senator Joe Lieberman and Congressman Trey Gowdy held a series of congressional hearings to consider reauthorization of the programs, but the bills did not progress through the legislative system. And then there were a series of rallies of increasing size held by advocacy groups and populated by low-income parents and children of the district that called for reauthorization of the program. Parents testified at these hearings. They made a documentary. They participated in documentaries about this program, and they shared the story of why this program is important to them. And so finally, in April of 2011, while all of DC and the country was waiting for a final resolution of the continuing resolution on the budget, it was announced that President Obama, Speaker Boehner, and Majority Leader Reid had agreed on the final form of that budget resolution, and it would include a reauthorization of the Opportunity Scholarship Program under the principles of Senator Lieberman's bill, and that included more funding and expansion and some other revisions in the program. So what are the conclusions about the school choice journey? Basically, parents want choices for their children. They want the opportunity to guide their child's education through choice. That parents they follow this very sort of logical preference for satisfying the safety needs of their children before they really focus on the academic quality of schools. They get there eventually, but maybe not at the very start. And they often use these subtle behavioral and attitudinal measures of student success as opposed to strictly student test scores. Also, it's important that we understand that these parents can be successful in choice programs, but they need assistance. That informational supports and a sort of coaching and guidance are really important for these parents to do successful school searches and to choose well for their children. And then, boy, if you want to get a group of parents politically activated, take school choice away from them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I realized didn't give you your full introduction, though you were luckily able to work that in there. Dr. Wolf's information is available in your packet. Now, we'd like to have just kind of a conversation up here at the dais. I want to give our panelists a quick opportunity to maybe offer some thoughts and reactions to what you heard. Here immediately to my right is our fearless leader here at AEI Education, Rick Hess. For those of you who don't know him, none of you, no, but he has been a prolific writer and speaker on education issues. His book last year, Cage Busting Leadership, was a roaring success with Harvard Education Press. He would probably like me to tell you he's following it up, Cage Busting Teacher, which comes out in just a couple months now, which is very exciting. To his right, we have Kara Kerwin, who is the president of the Center for Education Reform. Has been a strong advocate for school choice, and particularly around a lot of the sort of communications issues around there. I know she was in New York City yesterday, got out before the storm as the crew from School Choice Week rang in the New York Stock Exchange. So it's great to have her here this morning. I think, Rick, maybe let's start with you. Some just your reactions, takeaways, what struck you in Pat's presentation and his book?
Sure. I think, it's clearly worth reading. It's fascinating stuff. Maybe 3 or 4 points I'll make, and then I'll kick it over to Kara. One is what Pat opened with, his research question, is researchers have this natural but unfortunate habit of studying the stuff that they can get funded to study, the stuff that they can publish in fancy journals, the stuff that'll get them tenure, and at the end of the day, the stuff that they're going to get less grief for studying, which means that there's a huge incentive to study stuff in terms of test scores. And so we often wind up talking about whether things work, whether it's teacher preparation, or whether it's new curricula, or whether it's a school intervention, or whether it's school choice, in terms of whether reading and math scores got higher, whether or not that's really what we think is important, or really what we think is going to change at the time period we're looking at. So it's just a reality, and I think it's been a hugely problematic reality because it has caused us to talk about a lot of different educational improvement efforts, not in terms of whether they drive the things that we believe are good for kids, but whether they drive the things that we happen to be able to measure. Most people on both sides of the school reform conversation want schools to be places of wonder. They want schools to be places of joy. They want kids to be safe. They want kids to be challenged. They want kids to explore the world. They want kids to meet adults who can mentor them. They want kids to come out at the end of the day enlivened and energized. Now, its problem is we have no idea how to measure hardly any of that. And it is absolutely fair to point out that we are often frustrated that schools don't seem to be doing any of this for our kids as well as they can or should be. So what we say is, well, if we figure out some building blocks, we can move kids forward on that. And if we get those building blocks right, we're probably getting this other stuff too. And those building blocks are reading and math scores, which at least we can push folks on. Problem is I'm actually not at all sure those are good proxies for all the stuff we really care most about. And I'm not at all sure that when you move reading and math scores, you're moving those other things in the right direction. But that's a conversation we tend not to have. And researchers actually tend not to be very helpful on this, because there is the camp of incredibly well-trained, incredibly thoughtful econometricians who are using everything in their toolbox to help us more thoughtfully and precisely measure whether we're seeing scores move. And then there's a bunch of people, mostly in schools of education, who intuit that this stuff is limited, but they don't actually engage it in a very healthful or productive way. They don't explain the limitations. They don't offer other more nuanced thoughts on measurement. What they tend to do is denounce the people doing this research as neo-corporatist swine, as tools of major foundations, as, you know, a variety of nasty things. And so instead of us being able to have smart, interesting, useful arguments about how do we tell whether schools are good at what they're doing, we wind up in these bizarre peripheral culture wars, which just aren't that useful or productive. So what more than anything else, I think what really struck me about the school choice journey, and where I think Pat and Tom Stewart deserve just enormous credit, is they are among the very few folks who have the investment of time and energy and expertise in doing real high caliber evaluative work, trying to measure whether things get better. Pat has spent a lot of years since we were grad students at Harvard together building the expertise and the groundwork and the know-how and methods to do this stuff well. And it's easy to keep doing things that you know how to do and that foundations will give you lots of resources to do. And what Pat and Tom did here is they said, you know what? Let's take up an entirely different kind of challenge. Let's wade into all of this messy stuff that's not going to show up in fancy journals, that's not going to get covered on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post, just because it's a really important piece of the puzzle that we've missed. And Pat, I mean, I think it's just awesome that you're doing this, and I hope other folks will emulate. Just two other thoughts let me offer. One is Pat showed in the bar chart, one of the striking things to me, not surprising, but striking nonetheless, was how little attention parents seem to pay to test scores. Not surprising, because this is actually fairly similar to what Mark Schneider and Jack Buckley found in charter schools Hope or Hype about 7 or 8 years ago, similar to what some of the late 1990s political science on this found by folks like Mark Schneider, who's the guy at CU Denver now who did
Paul Teskey.
Paul Teskey. You know, they did some of this in American Journal of Political Science and such. So not surprising, but striking, because the way we talk about school improvement today, you would think that test scores are the defining characteristic of good schools and what parents are looking for. And it turns out they're not. And I think that should actually cause people to wrestle with this much more than they seem inclined to. Because somebody is wrong here. Either these parents are wrong. They're naive, they're misinformed, they're a danger to their own children because they don't know what good schools look like, or our criteria for how we casually talk about good schools are wrong. And I think it's the latter, for the reasons that Pat indicated. I think it's like talking about a stock price as a way to measure whether a company's doing good. If you're talking to a bunch of people who could invest in this or that company out of hundreds, things like stock price and earnings are good, kind of easy to use comparative metrics to see where should you invest. But if you're actually working in a company or you're trying to decide whether to buy their product, you don't care about their quarterly earnings. You care about how they go about their work. You care about your interaction with the people who work in the stores. And I think what Pat's pointing out is that we have these metrics, which are useful. Reading and math scores tell us something. They're useful when we look at how states are doing overall. They're useful to ask whether or not a school district is going in the right general direction. But they're incredibly clumsy and limited metrics when talking about a particular school or teacher, and yet we have come to use them to talk about particular schools and teachers. I think the more useful way to think about those test scores is kind of like food safety. And this is how we started talking about test scores 2 decades ago in terms of high stakes accountability. Let's use them to make sure we don't have really, really awful schools, just like we don't want really, really awful, unsafe restaurants. But let's understand that beyond that, we just can't put too much weight on simple metrics. Unfortunately, in the intervening 20 years, I think we have gotten caught up in this test score enthusiasm. And third and finally, Pat and Tom talk about this parental transformation they witness from clientelism to citizenship. And it's interesting because on the one hand, I'm cheered for those parents. I think it's great. On the other hand, it does strike me that pretty clearly they are becoming engaged in citizens around what they see as an entitlement, something that is being given to them, and they are mobilized to protect something they've been given. And generally, my personal take on America today is not that we have too little citizen activity around making sure I get what's mine. However, these are people who, as Pat noted, don't have very much. And more significantly, this is actually, I think, a really genial and admirable version of wanting to get what's yours, is I have infinitely more sympathy for people who are out wanting to preserve an entitlement that lets their children have a chance at a good education and a chance to succeed, as opposed to somebody whose fight for an entitlement is that they would like a bigger cost of living adjustment on their Social Security check or their disability check. So I think one of the things that's useful to think about is whether or not there are certain kinds of citizen conflict or citizen entitlements that are probably healthier for the soul of the citizen involved and healthier for the republic. And as I was dwelling on this, I think there probably are. And I think this is an example of the kind of entitlement that's probably better and more defensible for all concerned.
And retirees, send your comments to Rick Hess.
Cara, I'd love to hear your reactions.
Sure. Well, I think the most important takeaway is finally, somebody has taken the time and done the hard work to prove that parents know how to make choices. And I'll sort of paint the picture here. For the past 20 or so years, as all these debates have been going on, the biggest criticism or one of the biggest myths are those parents don't know how to make choices. Those parents don't know what's best for their kids. And that's how our whole system has been designed around just telling people what their school should look like. But the school choice journey really does show that when given some information, when given choice, and given the ability to improve their children's lives, any parent, all parents, regardless of their socioeconomic status, can make a good decision about their children's future. And part of what has frustrated me for so long is, and even our own friends say it, that parents aren't capable of making good decisions about schools. We are it's sort of like the soft bigotry of low expectations when we don't actually empower parents to make those decisions. The DC Opportunity Scholarship Program and all the debates going up to its passage a decade ago were really about, well, they don't know what they're doing. And I think this evidence really does show for the first time that they do know what they're doing and that there are other things that we should be valuing about a child's educational experience that all the researchers haven't looked at before, as Rick pointed out. So I think this is a really important body of evidence that school choice does work, and that parents, regardless of where they are in life, can make choices. Another criticism that sort of dovetails on that is that only good parents make choices and get their kids into these school choice programs or charter schools. So only the good parents, that's why they're doing well. That's why the programs are succeeding, because you're creaming. And this really shows that that is not the case. As long as families knew that they had the opportunity, they went for it. And being a part of the early application process, being part of going out and knocking on doors in DC to inform parents about these options as they were coming to the fore, you really did see that. And it's hard to sort of quantify or even qualify sometimes when you say, no, you don't get it. These parents really do know how to make choices. And finally, for once, it's a relief to have something that tells that story. The other part that I think is very telling, as Senator Scott was here earlier, the great Joe Lieberman, and he did the foreword in this book, and I really would suggest reading it because it'll be an eye-opener for a lot of people, just beyond the quantitative data about school choice. But the one thing, and I think the politicians, and I wish Senator Scott were still here, but the one thing that we have to remember as we go into all these deliberations on Capitol Hill about ESEA, about all these choice programs, especially where we are politically with the control on Capitol Hill, is that it's just not true that politicians cannot work in a bipartisan manner to get things done. And we have to remember that the DCOSP and its passage really was a demonstration that you could do the right thing for people if you put politics aside. And I think without really strong leadership on Capitol Hill, this program won't survive. So I think we need to make sure and push our elected officials to really govern and lead and try and build those bridges so that we can keep this program alive, so that these parents can continue on their journey, and so that their children can continue to be safe, achieve well academically, and have become more active and engaged citizens. It's what we need for America. And again, school choice is more important than just the test scores and the data. It's really about parent choice and parent power.
Great, thank you. A reaction that I had, Pat, that I'd like to hear your thoughts on is that, someone might take a look at what you found in this, particularly, looking at your table of what parents value, and say, since at least a nation at risk, if not longer, we've wanted to close the achievement gap. We almost never hear talk of education about closing the achievement gap. But if the families that participate in this program don't value the scores that are used to measure the achievement gap, school choice might not be that great of a tool to close the achievement gap, because it's just not why people pick the schools they go to. If someone were to say that to you, what would your reaction be?
Well, I think that parents would like to see higher test scores in the schools their kids attend. They'd like to see higher test scores by their own students, but it's not the highest priority. It's not the most essential thing. Basically, the way I like to put it, the other outcome that we school choice researchers are finally examining now, and we did in our congressional evaluation of the DCOSP, was educational attainment, was rates of high school graduation and college enrollment. And the way I like to put it is how far you go matters a lot more than how much you know. And there's an extensive literature in support of that a child with mediocre test scores who graduates from high school and goes to college is going to do a lot better in life than a student with high test scores who drops out of high school. It's just a plain fact. So in a sense, I think the parents are onto something, that a child's attitudes and behaviors and commitment and grit and conscientiousness and personal responsibility, these are all things that ultimately matter more than how well they bubble in a score sheet on a test. And that's not to totally disparage test scores. I do think it's a valuable metric. But we've treated it as the be-all and end-all, as the summation of effectiveness in education, and that's a very narrow and empiric sort of encapsulation of what education and learning really are, as Rick pointed out.
Rick, do you see it the same way?
Yeah. It's funny. I did a book back in 2004, I guess, called Common Sense School Reform, and one of the things I said, look. Testing and high-stakes accountability are useful if you're literally and honestly trying to address the bottom. Again, I think it's like inspectors, of restaurants. If you see vermin in a restaurant, if you see unsafe food practices, you probably don't want people eating there, and that is a reasonable. That's a reasonable cause to kind of shut a place down. But beyond that, there's lots of other stuff that's going on. What people are looking for, what's appropriate. And I think what's happened is we took an idea which made sense when used with discretion to try to identify schools that were clearly and unalterably failing, not just because of the student population or because of priorities, but the handful of schools that really shouldn't be ongoing concerns. And we have tried to make that into a recipe for driving school improvement throughout the system. And I think what's happened is we have turned reading and math scores into a shorthand for school quality when they're not. They're just really limited, imperfect stand-ins for larger conversations of school quality, because the things that matter are the things that Pat just alluded to, in particular academic persistence. And I think one of the interesting things at this point in time is a larger conversation is, moving that direction. Hopefully we will be able to throw out the bathwater, but hold on to the baby. But in particular in the school choice conversation, I think school choice advocates who long used test scores to critique public alternatives, or traditional district alternatives, need to be careful of getting, hoist on their own petard, and need to be careful of looking like raging hypocrites. So I think the way Pat is talking about it, that these are one useful metric, there's something people should be attuned to, but they're not what they have often been held up as, is I think perfectly appropriate. And so in your short question, this is the problem with closing racial or socioeconomic gaps in measured test scores the be-all and end-all of school improvement, is I have long worried that has taken us too often in unproductive directions.
Sure. Cara, I was wondering if I could pose to you. So in the middle of Pat's presentation, he talks about this movement from clients to consumers. And I would imagine perhaps if our conversation this morning was held in a venue not the American Enterprise Institute, some people, the hair on the back of the neck might start to stand up when they hear, families are supposed to be consumers. I think education's a democratic or a public good. How do you respond to people who get nervous when we start talking about families as consumers?
Well, to kind of go to Rick's point about, restaurants and how we look at food safety issues, I mean, it's just a common sense test. You know something good is going on in a place or you don't. And so if we can't allow parents to be consumers of their own child's education, one, we're not going to drive quality, and two, again, we're setting low expectations. So I think the more consumerism that goes on, the more ability to shaping the new citizen or shaping children is to provide options. We've got to grow the market, but it really should go back to treating parents as consumers. We have great products in this country because the consumer drove that. I wouldn't go buy a car that wasn't safe or that didn't have the right requirements like seat belts or whatever. Why should we force parents to go to schools where they might not feel safe? So consumerism really can drive quality, and quality, again, is in the eyes of the beholder. I think we need to be valuing what parents value more in terms of the outcomes, and stop trying to use test scores as the only measure to really focus on what kind of inputs we got to put into schools. It's really, let's let the consumerism drive quality.
Sure.
Mike, just to build on what Cara just said, so if you think about like a restaurant inspector, right, they don't shut restaurants down because they don't think the food tastes as good as they'd like it to be. They don't shut it down because they think the signage is lousy. They shut it down because it's stuff that customers can't judge for themselves. Customers are not able to go into the kitchen and poke around and see whether there's, unsafe practices going on. So if you think about, right, the idea is not that they're supposed to be second guessing the customer, but that they're looking at things that the potential client can't judge for themselves. I think that's a way to think about what's the right balance to strike here. And what it suggests is not that we don't want to make sure that parents, don't stumble into horrific choices, but that there's a difference between that kind of safety net and trying to decide, much more aggressively about how much time every school ought to be spending on reading and math.
Sure. Pat, I was wondering if you could, maybe if you wanted to chime in that one, but I'll pose another one to you as well. I wonder, how do charter schools fit into this mix? I know it's changed the landscape of Washington, D.C. and all across the country.
Sure. So first, on the education as a public good matter. Technically, that's incorrect. Education, K-12 education is a mixed good. It's clearly and obviously a mixed good. There are elements of education that benefit and accrue to the individual students exclusively, and there are elements of education that generate positive externalities that benefit society in general. So it's clearly a mixed good. And in fact, our Supreme Court made that statement in Pierce versus Society of Sisters when they said the child is not merely the creature of the state, that the parents have interests in being involved in directing a child's education. And the fact is, when you look at the civic outcomes of private schooling and school choice program, including charter schooling, they actually are as good or better than the civic outcomes from traditional public schools in terms of rates of voluntarism, political tolerance, political knowledge, political activity. Controlling for family background, schools of choice do as well as traditional public schools, and in many times better, on these measures of the civic preparation of students. On the charter school factor, it was a very interesting part of both of our studies, the official evaluation, the quantitative evaluation we did, and this qualitative study, because they were a dynamic and growing part of the school choice scene. And there were a substantial number of students, about 14%, who left charter schools to go to enter the school choice program, basically saying, even the independent charter schools in D.C. don't have something that I want for my child that private schools do. So that was the point Senator Scott made about expanding the options beyond just public school options. And the other thing we saw is that a substantial number of students who declined the scholarship, basically left the program, did so because their child got into a desired charter school. So choice was kind of feeding on choice and competing against choice in this program in a very dynamic school choice atmosphere. So I think charter schooling is a big part of it too. There certainly are a lot of charter school models that are exciting and that are attractive to these parents for the reasons that we describe in our book. But the bottom line is there are some families who feel that only private schools provide certain things that they want for their child, and part of that is religion, but there are other non-religious reasons as well.
I'll just add one thing. Over this past summer, it was really, really interesting because, as you mentioned, there's 45% of DC's public school students are in charter schools. Then you've got this really competitive scholarship program. When you have school choice and when you actually are treating parents like consumers, you start to see people behave a little differently. And in fact, DC public school principals spent most of their summer, knocking on doors and trying to win the hearts of their families back. So they were trying to treat their families like consumers. And it was an amazing sort of revelation for them that, hey, we better do something to try and compete. So choice really does lift all boats, and it really does help, us adults behave a little differently.
Sure. Another interesting finding that you brought up, that the number one thing that families looked at was student motivation and change in motivation. I know, Rick, you recently gave a big vision talk over at the National Geographic Center where you envisioned education as a handshake. So it's between a student and a family and a school, but each part plays a role. How do you react when you see both families judging student motivation as well as seeing these obvious increases in student motivation?
Yeah, I think it makes a ton of sense. I think you speak to most parents. I think you speak to most educators, and the thing that they're confident is going to be a leading indicator of whether children are going the right direction is whether kids are trying to go the right direction. So, do you want to know if a music teacher is a good music teacher? It's, does the kid want to practice? Is a coach a good football coach? It's, do kids look forward to going to football practice? I just think it's kind of a truism in life. So I think that's right. Partly, Pat, I'm actually curious. I'd love to hear your thought on this. One of the things that I find disconcerting, for instance, is you put up on the slide, the one father who says, part of, our job has got to be to prepare our kids to meet this bar. But then, as you note in the book, other parents kind of push back against that. And it seems to me that one of the things that I worry about with choice, with consumerism, is that when parents see the school is there for, to please them, is it's not necessarily a strong foundation for mutual responsibility. That, I do want principals to go out and recruit families and explain why the school's great for them. But I also worry about what we've done in higher ed, where professors are so worried about placating students, for instance, that I think it leads them to be less demanding or less strict than they might have otherwise been. So I'm just curious, how do we think about that mutual responsibility in this kind of context?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Rick. You got to the heart of the matter, and it reminds me of an old aphorism that everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die first. And I really felt that was the point that the parent was making who initially raised this issue. She said, I chose a school for my child that had strict disciplinary policies because I think that's very important for him, but then he got into trouble right away, and because he's not used to that, and so I want the school to be a strict school, but I want them to make special accommodations for my child, given their background and experience, and in a way that's perfectly rational. I want it all, but there's also a real tension there, and that tension really informed this discussion. So and that's why I think the gentleman who rose in defense of maintaining high standards, was making your point, which is we can't kill the golden goose because we want it to do exactly what we want it to do. I mean, schools have to be able to maintain their integrity as educating students, with a vision and with a school environment that they feel is essential to their school mission. Parents need to make choices based on that, and they need to be aware going in what the challenges are going to be, that these environments are going to challenge their children. And many of them explicitly want that, but they also have to be aware that, that's going to be difficult at times, that there is going to have to be these attitudinal and motivational transformations in their child, and if not, it's not going to work out.
Sure. So I'm going to go ahead and ask one more question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Again, those of you that are following along at home, we've actually already had some questions on Twitter, which I'm going to try and work into the conversation. The hashtag is @AEI. Or you could also, if that's too long, tweet them right at me, MQ_McShane. But my last question to the panel, Rick, I'll start with you because you mentioned this before, that this is important research, not enough of it is done. How do we get more research like this?
I think academics, we often forget, respond to professional incentives. Academics are worried about what's going to get published in respected places, what's going to get talked about and reported upon, what's going to get them tenure, what are foundations or agencies going to fund. And the reality is, in the last 15 years, the vast majority of all of those have been go find somebody who has got simple, clear measurements that may or may not tell us very much, but they're easy to defend. The best of these is test scores. Graduation rates is also in that mix. And then measure that stuff. And in order for that emphasis to change, we really need leading lights within the academy, within foundations, to push for a useful broadening of that research. Now, it's true that lots of this kind of qualitative stuff is done, particularly by faculty in schools of education. But again, I think it's generally framed as oppositional. It's not necessarily I don't think it brings, in too many cases, the kind of methodological care that Pat brings. And frankly, the scholars don't necessarily bring the kind of credibility to the project as thoughtful and even-handed kind of observers of the world that Pat brings to this project. So I think it's partly this shift in gravity, and then that shift in gravity needs to be enticing enough that researchers with real credibility and chops choose to take the challenge.
Sure. And so, Pat, was that your experience? Was it a struggle to get this funded, to get people to take interest in it? And maybe the other question, would you do something like this again?
Sure. Well, I have to express my gratitude to the Annie Casey Foundation. They funded this project. They provided generous funding. This is resource-intensive work, holding focus groups, getting parents to the sessions, and training researchers to be objective and systematic in conducting this research. That all takes a lot of effort and resources, and Annie Casey stepped up to the plate and provided the funding, so we appreciate that. I think it's fascinating. I think we are starting to see some more studies of this. Carolyn Satin-Bajaj study of school choice, high school choice in New York is another example of research in this vein. And I'm hoping that as the test score analysis, as the 47th test score analysis, is released, and that whole issue is saturated. I mean, we have meta analyses that can be done on these studies. There are so many test score studies out there that researchers see this as a very important complementary form of study that shows a lot about how these programs work, warts and all.
Great. Wonderful. So I think we're going to turn it over to the question and answer period. We're going to have Max and Isaac with microphones. Again, for those of you, because it always bears repeating, if you could do me a favor, identify yourself by name and affiliation. And again, please try and get to a question quickly. Thank you. We'll take the first question right here.
Hi, my name is Andrew Mullins. I'm with Homeschool Legal Defense Association. And over the past, I guess, about decade and a half, we've seen homeschooling grow dramatically. They're estimating it's around 2.1 million today. Can't really know the precise number. But with that trend, would you say that trend coincides with parental attitudes towards parents knowing what's best for their kids rather than school test scores, or maybe their dissatisfaction with the current way schools work?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, when you chart the growth of different types of schooling in America, homeschooling has gone up very dramatically. Charter schooling's gone up a lot. Publicly funded private school choice has increased substantially, but family-funded private school choice has actually declined. So a lot of families are making the decision, if I'm going to have to commit resources to my child's education, I might as well have full control over it through homeschooling. And there have been a lot of research about why people homeschool. The old shibboleth that it's just a bunch of end of days people, hunkering down in their bunker, has been shattered by the fact that the number one predictor of whether or not you're homeschool is how many degrees the parents in the family have. So basically, you homeschool when you can in many circumstances. I lived in Montgomery County, Maryland for a long time, and Montgomery County, Maryland has the highest percentage of homeschooled children in the United States. Montgomery County, Maryland. That just shows you that there are different reasons for homeschooling. Sometimes it's sort of avoiding the high pressure, high test culture that we've been discussing here. Sometimes it's to customize education for particularly gifted kids. Sometimes it's to customize education for special needs kids. Sometimes it's just to provide a different kind of education for students. So homeschooling is an interesting dynamic. It's very difficult to study because it's difficult to get access to families and to get access to data about homeschooling families. One of my graduate students, Albert Chang, was able to get some data. He did a study of the effect of homeschooling on political tolerance of students and found it actually had a positive effect. And his empirical article about that became the most downloaded article in the Journal of School Choice in its entire history because it was so unique and really filled a void.
That's great. And just for a sense of context, so if there are about 2.1 million students in homeschool, I think there are around 2.7, 2.8 million in charter schools, I think around 5 in private schools, and about 300,000 using vouchers or tax credits just to get and 50 million school children total, just to get a sense of scale. I want to take a question from Twitter, which was, how can families learn about the options that are available to them? Cara, you want to?
Well, our we are terrible about providing information to parents and making it easy. In fact, only using test scores or creating these really complex systems to provide data is very intimidating. So we as advocates for school choice and for parent power need to push our states and our community leaders to provide data in new ways. Here in DC, there have been a lot of organizations that have created like Fight for Children. They've put together manuals and books, but a lot of it really does require like boots on the ground and going into communities and talking to people. That's really how most people, especially low-income families, will get information. You've got to go to where they trust you. You know, you've got to go into their community centers or their churches and really build trust within the community so that they can understand and learn more about these opportunities. And that's really the only way to do it. You can't just go in and say, I'm going to put you here, or you're going to go there. They've already told us they don't want that anymore, but we have to go in and educate and inform them. And once they have information, they know how to make good choices, and they're empowered. So I think it's really about boots on the ground, grassroots.
So, and Patrick, in your experience, were there some methods that were more effective or less effective than others in helping inform parents?
The most effective method, as Kara mentioned, was getting community leaders involved. In the first few years of the OSP, there was a shortage of applicants initially because the information campaigns were all sort of over the top, radio, buses, and things like that, but they were all indirect. Once community leaders got more involved in spreading information throughout the neighborhoods, then there was a major influx of applicants to the program. So that's essential. But the other way that I think families want to get information, they want comparative information. They do want some sort of expert advice and gentle guidance from people they trust, but they also do like informational guides. And there are organizations like greatschools.net, which have sort of pioneered the idea of compiling consistent information about all the schools in an area that has a lot of school choice, traditional, public, charter, and private, and making it available to parents in an easily digestible form. And the important thing is that it's comprehensive. It's not just test scores. It's also these more subtle things that matter to parents about the school's educational philosophy, curriculum, and disciplinary policies and things like that. So those kinds of guides are really important. New Orleans is a great example of that. There's a parent-driven nonprofit called the New Orleans Parent School Guide that basically compiles all the about the schools in New Orleans since all but 7 schools of New Orleans are schools of choice now.
Great. Another question from here in the audience. Yes, Max, if you'd be so kind, right here in the center.
Thanks. Stephen Corman, U.S. Department of Education. Full disclosure, I worked on the project a few years ago, though, too. But my question is for Pat. Can you? I'm sorry, I must have missed the slide. Can you elaborate a little bit on the importance of the factor of parental involvement in choice?
Sure. So Steve is being humble here because Steve was my right-hand man when we launched this project. He basically oversaw. He was the project administrator when we ran all these focus groups. He was absolutely essential to the success of the project and co-authored the annual reports that eventually evolved into this book. So it's great to see you, Steve. I appreciate your question. Parental involvement, it's a really interesting question in school choice, and it's another area where I think we had a certain set of expectations that have been shattered by reality. I mean, I think the initial expectation was that expanding school choice would increase parental involvement in a child's education, and that increase in parental involvement would be the specific mechanism that leads to higher test scores and all these other positive outcomes. But in reality, we found things that are much more complicated in our focus groups, that in some cases there were parents who were more involved in their child's education when they were in a traditional public school because they were afraid for the child. And once they transferred them to a private school of choice that they knew was safe, then they sort of felt that problem was taken care of, and they actually needed to spend less time at the school. Generally, what we find is there's a lot of variation and inconsistency in whether or not expanding school choice leads to increased parental involvement, and if it increases both of the dimensions of parental involvement in the child's school and parental involvement in educational activities in the home. There's a little more evidence that school choice increases parental involvement in educational activities in the home, helping kids with homework and things like that, whereas the evidence is less consistent that it actually leads to greater parent involvement in the school for those reasons that I discussed.
Sure. We have time for perhaps one more question. Max, if we could get it down front here.
Hi, I'm Dave Price, 4 decades in urban education in various forms. I want to just refer here to number 3, if I could, for a minute, where parents use student behavior, not test scores, to gauge progress. Not only is that wise, of course, because I happen to agree with it, that's why I think it's wise. But my question goes here, okay? If they're feeling satisfied there, then something's, and they weren't feeling satisfied in the public school, something's going on in these schools of choice that either wasn't going on or they weren't aware of. In your studies, did they express to you why they saw such factors as motivation, behavior, these things that we don't do enough to study, why they felt comfortable in those schools versus wherever they were before?
Great question.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and that would be great. I mean, we didn't probe as much as we should have on that question because this was a great voyage of discovery, and this was one of the surprising things that we discovered. There were some hints that, you know, the idea of just a strong culture at the school was something that was attractive to them, and they felt, you know, was motivating for their child, that there was a strong and consistent culture of mutual respect for kids, of learning, and investment into the educational project. There was, you know, many parents said that they thought that the religious environment established and reinforced the culture. Now, a lot of them were not necessarily, they didn't confess the exact religion that the student or that the school adhered to. I mean, there were many cases of Baptist kids attending Catholic schools, but the parents typically said what's more important is that there just be religious values infusing the school. It's less important that it be their religious values. So I think the religious element was a factor as well, but that's definitely a question that will require some follow-up research to get more. Yeah, there we go. Who's going to fund it?
Wonderful. If you would be so kind as to join me in thanking our panel. I do want to just bring your attention to 2 upcoming events here at AEI. On Thursday, February 5th, so next Thursday, talking about the use of philanthropy, from 9 to 2:45, we're hosting a big research conference. Is the new education philanthropy good for schools? Examining foundation-funded school reform. The week after that, on February 11th, from 3:30 to 4:45, we're hosting co-CEO of Teach for America, Elisa Villanueva Beard. So both of those should be very interesting conversations. We look forward to seeing you there. Have a great day.